We have agreed a first set of sanctions, and over the course of the day, we will conclude these together. I said earlier that the situation we find ourselves in today is a completely different one than it was. Thus, due to the latest developments, we need to assess the situation, not least when it comes to Nord Stream 2. I have asked the German Ministry of the Economy to give us the report that it has on the energy supply for the grid authority so that there's no certification of the pipeline possible now. This sounds a bit technical, but without this certification, Nord Stream 2 cannot go online. The Department of the German Ministry of Economics will reassess the security of our supply needs in light of what has taken place in the last day or two. In this phase, it is important, apart from initial sanctions, to prevent a further escalation and with it a disaster. All of our diplomatic efforts will be aimed at achieving this. These are very difficult days and hours for Europe. 80 years after the end of the Second World War, it would seem that a war is threatening us in Eastern Europe. It is our job to mitigate this disaster, and I appeal to Russia once again to help us in this process. Thank you very much.
And let's talk more about the breaking news that's been coming into us today about the halting of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline with our chief political correspondent, Melinda Crane. The Chancellor there halting the certification process of the pipeline. I think I can safely say we were both extremely surprised to suddenly hear this happen on this day at this hour. But what does it all mean?
Yes, I think we were surprised in part because Chancellor Scholz has for so long not uttered the words Nord Stream 2 in connection with any form of a sanctioning process. And he had maintained a certain strategic vagueness, perhaps to keep Russia guessing, but also because, of course, as our Eastern European expert there just pointed out, many people in the Social Democratic Party, Chancellor Scholz's party, have long advocated closer commercial relations with Russia and really maintained the idea that this pipeline is a purely private sector project. And he now firmly went on the record saying we are not certifying operation of Nord Stream 2. It's interesting. He did not say we are imposing a package of sanctions and Nord Stream 2 is part of that package. He said we simply won't certify operation because that depends on a security assessment that Germany's security of energy supply will not be harmed, but in fact helped by the pipeline. And we can no longer say that's true. So a technical reason, but nonetheless, that means this very important German-Russian project is on ice, and it has faced a lot of criticism within the EU. It has faced a lot of criticism from the US. Now, Scholz has given us the clear word that it is on ice, and that will be good news to many of those partners.
And the US will be jubilant about this, no doubt. The EU and US even more unified in their approach to Ukraine now that troops have been ordered to these separatist regions.
That's right. We are nonetheless seeing scaled sanctions. So as we've been discussing, we don't know exactly what now will be in the EU foreign minister's package, but we're hearing some rumors and apparently individuals responsible for those breakaway republics and relations with them will be targeted, possibly the Duma members who now urged President Putin to recognize the breakaway, self-proclaimed breakaway republics, but not necessarily President Putin himself and those directly around him. So why? There may be many viewers saying, you know, why don't they just hit him with the full package right now? The idea is to create essentially an action and reaction situation where if he escalates, there is room for the EU and the US to escalate as well in order, in other words, to move to even stronger sanctions. And I think that's why also also many of us had thought Nord Stream would be part of that later level rather than already now. But there are still a number of other cards that the EU can play.
Because that's exactly what I was thinking. Wasn't that the last card left up his sleeve?
No, the biggest, the so-called nuclear option in economic sanctions would be excluding Russia from the payments transaction system known as SWIFT. That would make it very hard for this very energy-dependent economy to continue selling its resources on international markets. There's also talk, apparently, of some form of exclusion of Russian central bank bonds now already. But again, that is not certain that that will occur. That will make it hard for Russia to refinance its government deficits on the markets. That would also have a serious effect. So there are a number of escalatory sanctions measures that can be put into place, and that certainly is what the EU and the US clearly have been working hard to coordinate.
Melinda Crane, thank you very much for the analysis. Well, the United Nations Security Council has held an emergency session over the crisis. Russia used the meeting to accuse Ukraine of shelling residential areas in eastern Ukraine. The United States envoy promised it would bring new sanctions against Moscow. A growing number of world leaders and NATO have condemned Russia's actions.
President Putin has now violated Ukrainian sovereignty. He's sent troops in. He's broken international law. We will immediately institute a package of economic sanctions, which I think, as people would expect, targeted not just at entities in Donbass, in Luhansk and Donetsk, but in Russia itself, targeting Russian economic interests as hard as we can.
Russia shouldn't underestimate the resolve of the European Union. Vladimir Putin crossed the line yesterday, and there will now be a coordinated response from the Europeans together with the Americans.
Russia's clear attack on Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity is unprovoked. It is an attack on Ukraine's status as a UN member state. It violates a basic principle of international law, and it defies our charter. What is more, this move by President Putin is clearly the basis for Russia's attempt to create a pretext for a further invasion of Ukraine.
At present, all parties concerned must exercise restraint and avoid any action that may fuel tensions. We welcome and encourage every effort for a diplomatic solution.
Well, US and EU, envoys have been discussing the situation in Brussels. We can now cross to our bureau chief there, Alexandra van Namen. Alexandra, we heard about the first set of sanctions today from the EU, from Chancellor Scholz, and also the suspension of this shared pipeline between Russia and Germany, Nord Stream 2. Can you tell us more about the measures being discussed?
The EU ambassadors are meeting this morning to discuss the proposed sanctions, and we can imagine that they are now sitting together, going over a list, probably long list of names of individuals and entities, not only in Luhansk and Donetsk, but also in Russia, people and entities that are believed to be directly involved in what the European Union is calling an illegal act of recognition of those two breakaway regions in eastern Ukraine. And we also, as the German Chancellor just pointed out, expect them to, at least in principle, approve those sanctions today. They might be published then tomorrow. But it's not everything that's on the table. According to European officials, the European Commission has suggested member states to ban the trade of Russian bonds, for example, and they are proposing to put several hundreds of people on the sanctions list. And still, we have to say this could be just the first round of sanctions. There could be more coming, and that is what Eastern European countries and also the Baltic states have been demanding since yesterday. Now the European Union has to impose broader sectoral sanctions. That is what they are demanding.
Exactly, and that's what Scholz did mention there, that these were the first set of sanctions. Alexandra, what about NATO? Moscow wants to keep Ukraine out of the alliance and is demanding that NATO pull back from its borders. What can it do to strengthen security without antagonizing Russia?
Well, NATO is certainly not going to meet those demands expressed by Russia. And according to our sources at NATO headquarters, the North Atlantic Council is underway right now with the 30 ambassadors, the member states, sitting together with NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg. And I was told that this is part of the regular consultation they have. But of course, the item on the agenda is the Ukraine crisis, and NATO has been preparing for all possible scenarios. And of course, we still don't know what Putin's plan is for Ukraine, how he is planning to move forward, and that is what is being discussed at NATO. They have already ruled out that there will be NATO combat forces in Ukraine, but of course, one issue that has been on the agenda for a long time is now to increase NATO presence in Eastern Europe. We have to remember that there are NATO members that have borders with Russia, and especially they are very concerned and scared that this conflict, this crisis, could spill over further into Europe.
Alexandra von Hamann, thank you very much in Brussels for us there. DW correspondent Nick Connolly is in Kiev. Nick, what have you been hearing from the separatist regions in eastern Ukraine, in Donetsk and Luhansk?
Well, obviously there is a lot of worry that this is just the beginning, this is not the end of this crisis, that this is just the first step towards further escalation. We've seen increased shooting and increased conflict along that front line between Ukrainian government troops and those Russian-backed separatists in the last few days. Now, with this recognition of these self-proclaimed republics, there's worry that Russia could potentially even support those republics in taking the rest of Donetsk and Luhansk regions that are still under Ukrainian government control. Lots of people without water, without electricity because of the shooting, destroying critical infrastructure. A sense that that speech by Vladimir Putin, that rambling hour-long speech about all the grievances he saw Russia having suffered not only from the West since the fall of the end of the communist regime in the Soviet Union, but also over the 20th century, a sense that he has lots more scores to settle.
Nick, let's take a closer look at those breakaway regions in Ukraine that Russia has now recognized as independent.
Reminders of war are everywhere in Donetsk and Luhansk. The two provinces lie in eastern Ukraine on the border with Russia. Both declared independence after the revolution in 2014, which most in the region did not support. Separatists voted to join Russia and have fought Ukrainian forces for control ever since. Around 4 million people live in what's called the Donbas region. It's known for heavy industry and coal mining, and its large Russian and Russian-speaking population. In the main city Donetsk, banners read, "We are Russian." Moscow has handed out hundreds of thousands of Russian passports. But life is tough, caught in the middle. Many who can have left. Most pensioners are stuck. Others fight. Ukraine estimates there are around 35,000 separatist troops and accuses Moscow of filling out their ranks with Russian soldiers. In 2015, a ceasefire signed in Minsk helped end full-scale fighting. But the conflict has dragged on, leaving more than 14,000 people dead.
Nick, tell us more about how Ukrainians are reacting to these latest moves by Russia.
Well, I think there was a lot of consternation and head-scratching here in Kiev after that speech by Vladimir Putin that was watched by most people I know here. They couldn't really believe what they were hearing, and that the president of Russia was complaining about high water prices for civilians in Ukraine, about certain factories that had survived the collapse of communism only to go bankrupt under Ukraine's independence. So kind of crazy range of topics for a Russian president to be talking about in prime time. It took quite a long time for us to hear from Ukraine's President Zelensky. The the US, Germany had already commented on this. Zelensky went to speak to his top officials and then only came out to speak to the Ukrainian population deep in the night. He gave his speech in front of a map of Ukraine's internationally recognized borders with the Crimea and obviously Donbass there, said that Ukraine would never give up on those territories, never accept Russian control or independence of those regions. He said this was the time now for Ukraine's allies to show that they were really on Ukraine's side. That was, I guess, a kind of not very well-veiled dig at Germany, which has come in for a lot of criticism here in Ukraine for not supplying defensive weapons to Ukraine, although I guess that announcement from Olaf Scholz today that Nord Stream 2 is being put on ice will be welcomed here in Kiev as a sign that Germany is willing to sacrifice economic interests to support Ukraine in this conflict with Russia. But a sense here that they are very worried that Russia is looking for a cause for war, that Russia is going to try and provoke them, create maybe false flag operations, some kind of excuse to then send those Russian troops that are now flooding into those separatist-held areas across the front line into areas that are under Ukrainian government control.
Nick, can you give us more clarity as far as maps go, as you mentioned? What borders we're talking about and whether or not Russia will limit its deployment to these two separatist regions?
I mean, Ben, isn't that an extraordinary situation to be in, that we're talking about shifting maps and shifting borders in the 21st century? I don't think, even a few years ago, anyone else would have really believed that this was going to be a regular occurrence in Europe in the 21st century. I think that it's a very brave analyst who will try and give you any kind of clear prognosis on where this is going. But for now, it does seem like Russia is only going to recognise those self-proclaimed republics in their de facto borders where they are now, although the leadership of those republics say that they claim the full area of Luhansk and Donetsk regions, which for the most part are still controlled by Ukrainian government troops, so that they would potentially try and regain control of those areas that have been controlled by Ukraine since 2014, that never went under separatist control. So there's the kind of potential flashpoint there. There's been suggestions that Vladimir Putin still thinks that a lot more of eastern Ukraine is what he would see as historically Russian territory. There's been talk of maybe trying to establish a land route to Crimea to take a lot more territory so that Russia can access Crimea not only across that bridge they built, but also by land through territory that is Ukrainian. All the options seemingly on the table, and a very scary situation where it seems like these decisions are being taken in Moscow by Vladimir Putin on his own. His top officials yesterday in those filmed, publicised meetings looking like kind of school children giving their kind of exam results to their teacher, who was telling them off for not being quick enough and not being resolute enough in their statements. So a really scary time here, in a sense that this is a crisis that isn't going to an end, that this is actually just the beginning of a new and more dangerous phase.
And a very fluid situation full of uncertainties. Nick, thank you very much for trying to bring some clarity for us on the situation. Well, in the past hour, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz has announced a stop to the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline approval process. The major Russian-built pipeline has been awaiting German certification, but Scholz said the process has been suspended indefinitely following Russian aggression in Ukraine.
Due to the latest developments, we need to assess the situation, not least when it comes to Nord Stream 2. I have asked the German Ministry of the Economy to give us the report that it has on the energy supply for the grid authority, so that there's no certification of the pipeline possible now. This sounds a bit technical, but without this certification, Nord Stream 2 cannot go online.
Well, we're now joined by Eastern European expert Sergej Sumlenny in Berlin. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz halting Nord Stream. What's your reaction?
Well, it was really surprising to hear that the SPD Chancellor, the SPD is a party that stick to the Nord Stream 2 from the very beginning. Like ex-Chancellor Schröder and other politicians, that he cancels it or at least postpones it. And what is important here, and it is what is needed to be said, that your correspondent Nick Connolly was perfect and gave a perfect analysis of what is in the ground. But the pretext of the conflict, which was broadcasted channel 5 minutes ago, it was just terrible. It is not a separatist republics, it's Russian invasion troops which are there on the ground. It's not like conflict between separatists and Kyiv. It's Russian occupation which had been only now officially acknowledged by Moscow, but it doesn't mean that 8 years long it were not Russian troops on the ground, and Russian troops must be called Russian troops, and Russian invasion must be called Russian invasion, independently on what Putin is saying now. But regarding to Nord Stream, yes, it's surprisingly, and we'll see what happens, and we'll see what Russia will do. But still, like the economic sanctions, they are still very weak. What we see from the EU, from the US. The US has proclaimed sanctions against the occupied parts of Ukraine, which is even weaker than those we have seen with the Crimea. And we don't see anything regarding like Russian companies, Russian banks, Russian oil sector, Russian gas sector. And we need to sanction Russia now very hard, because what Russia does, Russia is on war on Ukraine, and Russia brings incredible losses to Ukrainian economy, and now actually annexed another part of Ukrainian territory, and this must be stopped.
And it sounds like the EU and US are now speaking with one voice. What will that encourage Vladimir Putin to do next?
Well, Vladimir Putin is obviously in his rage mode. Nick said it very perfectly described, as he described the speech of Vladimir Putin yesterday, 14 minutes of talking of all about a fantasy trauma he or his nation had suffered from bad West, bad US, bad communists, bad Ukrainians, etc. It was like a delusional speech of Vladimir Putin. And of course, he still has all his army on the border. I don't believe that he will attack right now, like full-scale attack, because now he will be most probably working on the further integration of the already occupied regions. And he has already got his small victory over the West and will present it to his nation. But it doesn't mean that the army has disappeared, and the army is like in 100 kilometers from Kiev, like in maybe 5 hours for a tank column to reach Kiev from the Russian territory. And this danger is still there. All Russian promises to pull troops back, they will lie. As we see, Russia brings new troops to Ukraine, to Ukrainian territories which Russia has already occupied, and the danger is there. And the West must continue to support Ukraine with weapons, deliver anti-air systems, deliver troops to Ukraine, deliver NATO troops, because this is the only thing which can stop Putin from further attack. And the only language he understands is language of brutal force. We must sanction Russia, and we must bring to Ukraine more troops and more weapons. That's how we can stop the war.
Just briefly, though, if Putin has what he wanted, what's Vladimir Zelensky's threat of cutting ties with Russia going to do?
Well, cutting ties with Russia is not a threat. It's a clear security mechanism. As long as your economy is tied to Russian economy, you are in danger. And we in Germany have demonstrated it with Nord Stream 2. As long as we still have gas supplies from Russia, our economy is dependent and our politicians remain corrupt. And that is a huge problem. And of course, for Ukraine, it is important to cut every single tie to Russia, because Russia is a threat to Europe, threat number one. Russian troops occupying Ukrainian territory. Russia organizes cyber attacks in Ukraine. Russia cuts supply or used to cut supply as long as Ukraine bought gas from Russia. Russia blackmailed Ukraine, etc. Of course, Ukraine must cut ties. But it's not a threat.
Sergej Sumlenny in Berlin, thank you very much for your analysis.
Thank you.
The escalation of the crisis in Ukraine has sent shockwaves through global markets. European stocks slumped to 7-year lows at the start of trading as an invasion of Ukraine by Russia appeared more likely than at any other point in recent months. Asian markets had also had their worst day for weeks. Meanwhile, investors sought out safe havens, pushing up the price of gold, and the price of Brent crude oil climbed to its highest point since 2015 over fears that Russian exports could be disrupted. Well, Western allies are rushing to implement sanctions after Russia recognised the independence of two regions of eastern Ukraine. The White House has already banned investment and trade in separatist regions. Other possible sanctions include banning Russia from the SWIFT banking system, making it difficult for Russians to receive money from abroad. The US also says that it's willing to cut off Russia's access to US dollars. Also on the cards is the possible suspension of the approval of the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline, which was set to deliver Russian natural gas to Western Europe via Germany. Well, let's discuss the situation further with Clemens Fuest, president of Germany's IFO Institute for Economic Research. Thanks for joining us on DW Business. Let's start off with those sanctions. How are any of those going to stop President Putin in his tracks? I mean, can they?
They can increase the cost for President Putin of proceeding with his strategy, but he doesn't seem very impressed. And we have to see that Russia has already been subject to sanctions after the 2014 Crimean crisis. So trade with other countries has been subdued since then. This makes it more difficult. Still, Russia exports a lot of natural gas to Europe, exports oil, and that would be a possibility. But here, the trouble is that Europe is so dependent on Russian gas that at least in the short term, there's little that can be done. More can be done in the medium term. And it's also possible that using targeted sanctions against particular companies or individuals even, some pressure may be put on Putin, although it's unclear how influential other people are in Russia or whether he's mostly taking decisions by himself.
Yeah, and you mentioned how Russia's very dependent, Europe is very dependent on Russian gas and oil supplies. How united are the Western allies behind these sanctions when they have different amounts to lose from each of them?
Well, there is a potential for conflict simply because the Western countries are very differently affected, or would be very differently affected by sanctions against Russia. So the next days, I'm afraid, will show to what extent they are able to put their differences aside and give a clear signal to Putin. What Putin has done yesterday very clearly shows that he doesn't take the European government seriously. He doesn't think they will be able to act decisively against him. Now we will see whether he's right or wrong with that assessment.
We've already seen the White House, in fact, President Biden signing an executive order banning investment by US firms in Donetsk and Luhansk. Is that something that's actually going to have an impact, or is that merely symbolic?
That I would think that this has no impact at all. It's purely symbolic, and it's clearly insufficient. So if it is left to that, Putin will feel encouraged to continue his expansionary policies. So the sanctions need to be much stronger than that.
And let's just turn to the impact that this has been having on global markets. We've seen stocks reacting dramatically to all developments in Ukraine. Why are investors so worried about the potential for a Russian invasion?
I think this is increased uncertainty and the impact on energy prices mostly. Higher energy prices are a burden on the economy. And there is a lot of uncertainty, and I suppose many investors expect other investors to sell, to get nervous, to flee to safe havens. I think that explains current developments. Again, a lot will depend on how this situation continues. If investors gain the impression that that will be it, that the crisis will not escalate further, financial markets will also come down, I would expect.
OK, Clemens Fuest from the IFO Institute, thank you for joining us and bringing us up to date on this moving story.